How to Survive Until You're Published, Season 1, Episode 15. Save the Cat writes a novel with guest author Don Carey.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to How to Survive Until You're Published. We're with Don Carey today. Don Carey is an author and software team leader currently living in Kansas. When not working or writing, he can be found riding his bicycle and playing the ukulele. As a child of the 70s and the 80s, he dreamed of a future world with video phones, pocket supercomputers, and televisions so thin and flat they could hang on a wall like a picture. He's currently using his forward-thinking imagination to develop a series of sweet, futuristic rom-com projects under the pen name Leslie DiCapo. That is awesome. We are so excited to have Don on.
Yeah, thanks for coming on.
You bet. I'm really excited to be here. I think this will be a lot of fun.
Yeah, so today we wanted to talk about plot. You had particularly mentioned the Save the Cat plotting structure. But just to kind of start things out, how do you typically start your plotting process when approaching a new project?
Well, I like to joke that I outline my outlines. As I mentioned in my bio, I do have a software engineering background. And so I think in a very structured way. And so I will very often take the ideas that I have and try and put them into some sort of organized points that I can work with. Usually there's either a couple of scenes that I'm starting out with. In my last project, it was the meet cute, how the main couple meets together for the very first time. And so I'll take those and look at my plotting template and see, okay, what things are going to happen at these different plot points.
I can definitely relate to that. I definitely like to outline things to a very extensively, because otherwise I feel like I don't know where I'm going. But what is it in particular you like about Save the Cat? And for anyone who's not familiar with Save the Cat, could you maybe describe it a little bit?
You bet. So Save the Cat is it was initially created by a man by the name of Blake Snyder, who was a screenwriter, and it was designed to kind of show some of the screenwriting techniques that he had used, the ways that when we're dealing with story, we've kind of all grown up with stories and hearing stories, and stories follow a very set structure, not because somebody sat down and said this is how it has to be, but because that's the way they've evolved to be that way. That's the way we learn best from them. And so he took the different points that he had identified in a successful screenplay and wrote them down. And there are 15 different points that he calls beats. And if you're able to hit these beats, some of them need to happen at specific points. Others happen like as a broader segment. And so we can talk a little bit about what each of the different beats are in Save the Cat. But the real value in this for me is it tells me what's going to happen next. And there are some really key, what are often called tentpole beats that the structure, the story kind of gets hung on. So for example, there's it starts out with the opening image, right? Every story, whether it's a movie or a book, you've got that first introduction to the world of the story where you are trying to understand what the story is about, what this world is. And in a movie, it's very often a montage type of a scene. In a book, we need to do things very, very differently. But we're setting up the scene and trying to understand what's going to happen first. And so I think it might be helpful to kind of talk about what some of the different beats are and where they occur in the story.
Yeah, we were just thinking that would be great. Yeah, so go ahead.
Yep. So I mentioned the tentpole beats, and there's really 5 of those. The first one is that opening image, opening where you're setting things up. There is the catalyst, and that is where something happens to go from the ordinary world into the new world. This is where the story really starts. You like to think about, I like to think about Star Wars as one of the ones that follows this pretty well. And so the catalyst is the point where Luke discovers the message from Princess Leia, right? That's the where something's got to change. And then the next part is break into two. So this very much follows, the 3 acts. So the first act is the beginning. Break into 2 is where we now go from that ordinary world, from the original place, into the second part of the story.
Yeah, I remember reading about that part, and it talks about how there's a clear difference between how the world was at the beginning and how the world is then. So it's like Harry going to Hogwarts. It's that contrast, that exact change.
Exact thing. And one of the things I love about studying the different story structures is, like I mentioned, we kind of expect stories to all follow the same pattern. And so even though there are a whole bunch of different story structure, they give them a little bit different names and they describe things a little bit differently, they all match up pretty well. And if you're going to the hero's journey, if you're familiar with that, there's a part of the story called Crossing the Threshold, and that's break into 2, right? That's where you're going from the ordinary world, from the original, and then you're going into the special new world. And so in the Star Wars analogy, that's when they blast off of Tatooine. So now we've gone from this dreary desert planet out into the adventure of space. And so from there, the next really kind of tentpole piece is the midpoint, where things happen in the middle there. So we're going from the beginning of, hey, we're starting an adventure, and now we're going into the second half of the adventure. And so in the Star Wars analogy, that's going to be where they get to the Death Star and they have to rescue the princess. And then the next tentpole place is All Is Lost. That's kind of a false defeat, where you think, okay, things are not going to go well, and then you have to come back to the break into 3, which is where we then go into the climax. And so the whole middle is kind of Act 2, and then we've got Act 3, which is the big climax. And so this gives me if I can figure out what these beats are and what's going to go on, then it's a lot easier to fill in than the rest of the story.
So you're saying, like, if you try to figure out like your opening image, your catalyst, your break into 2, midpoint, All Is Lost, break into 3, you try to figure out those basics, the tent poles, like you said,
right?
And then you kind of fill in the blanks from
and then
there.
You can fill in, and that's one of the other things that I really like about Save the Cat is I like the 7-point story structure. Those are kind of the same places, the same beats on there, but the Save the Cat has a total of 15 beats. And it helps you fill in a little bit more in the middle.
Yeah.
You definitely don't get quite as stuck.
You don't. There's a lot of things. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of list off what the different beats are in order, and we can talk a little bit about those. So we started with the opening image, right? This is where we're learning what the story is about, and this is a much more. This is page 1, or this is the first minute of the story, where we're setting the whole tone of the story. But then there's the next one is the setup. So we're trying to set up what is the story going to be about. So it's more than just setting the tone, but we're actually introducing the characters. We're introducing the conflict, and we're also then the third beat is the theme is stated. So there's some kind of theme that's going to happen within the story, and you state that somewhere in there. Now there's not really a set time when these things happen. You can have those all on the first page if you want. You can have those happen really kind of within the first 10%, I'd say.
I think she goes into your percentages. Sorry, she like breaks in the percentages down. So you can.
The percentages are great. And again, for one of the things that I can do with this type of a story structure is having those percentages. If I know, well, I want to write a 60,000 word novel, well, I can take 60,000 words and say, okay, well, by 6,000 words, I need to be hitting my catalyst, which is what happens about the 10% point.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we have this thing that's going to set off the story. And the next really 15%, so all the rest of that first act, that first quarter of the story is debate. So if you think about stories, this is the thing we need to do. Luke sees the message from the princess. Okay, that's the catalyst that starts everything going. So then he goes to Obi-Wan, and Obi-Wan says, well, he gives him his lightsaber. Here's, these great things. We can go do this. There's debate. I can't do this. I can't go. There's all the reasons why we can't have this adventure. Right. And so that debate takes the first, I'd say, quarter of the story. And it's at that point then that you break into two, is roughly the 25% mark. And the next thing that happens is when you break into two, you go into the second scene, there's what's called the B story. So you have the A story, which is the things that are about the external. And then the B story is something else that is going on. So
it's usually more of like the internal and the theme of your story, right? What your character needs to learn.
Right.
That they might not know.
Right. And so this is something that's all happening in that special new world, kind of the new adventure. And really the whole next quarter of the story from 25% point up to the 50% point is called fun and games. So this is where, all of the different things happen. These are exploring the strange new world and trying to understand some of the things that are going on there. So for example, you see Luke with the blast shield on, and he's trying to not get zapped by the little practice droid. All the fun in the games, you get to go along, but in the same time, you're trying to build the characters up, and you really know what that midpoint should be. And so everything in the fun and games is both building the character, it's building the world, but it's leading straight up to that midpoint.
So I've heard a lot of writers who use the Save the Cat beat sheet say they struggle a lot with the fun and games and knowing quite how to shape it towards the midpoint. Do you have any advice for writers using this outlining and plotting technique to really make sure your fun and games leads to your midpoint and builds to that?
Yeah, I think that's something that, you need to really have fun with it. That's probably the biggest advice I can give you. This should be something that is fun for you as a writer. It should be something that's fun for your reader. And so I like to think of what are some a little bit more crazy type of things or exciting things about this world. What is it about this story and this character that I can really get into and have some fun with. And some of the time, this is where, as much as of an outliner as I am, I do still get some benefit out of free writing. And so I'll free write some different scenes. I'll try and think, okay, what am I going to do in this area to make it fun? And so, I'm trying to think of the best way to look at this. Maybe if we can get into some other examples. But I know if there's going to be any kind of comedy element in here, this is a really good place for it. We think about R2D2 playing the space chest against Chewbacca, and we learn about Chewbacca and how, Wookiees don't, droids don't tear your arm off when they lose, kind of a comment. And so there's the fun pieces that go along with that. But we need to really, I guess, as you're looking towards that midpoint, the midpoint is going to be something where you're either going to have a false sense of victory or a false sense of defeat. And so you need to be able to set that up. What is it that they're trying to do within this first part of the story?
So yeah, they're either like running up a hill and falling down it, or they're either running up a hill and getting up the hill, kind of thing. They're either succeeding as they continue forward through the fun and games, or they're failing. Right.
And so what is it about this story that's interested you in writing it in the first place? If it's a romance, you've got your two characters have met, and they are either falling for each other. If it's, the type of story where you have, people who don't know each other and they have a kind of a slow burn, or if this is one of the enemies to lovers type of story, this is where they're constantly picking at each other, and you have that witty banter that's going on back and forth. In a science fiction or a fantasy world, this is where we're seeing some of the exciting creatures, we're seeing some of the fantastic locations, really just getting to learn why these characters are people that we want to spend time with.
Well, I feel like it's a lot of the adventure, the challenges, just kind of all the things that you're just raising the stakes, putting obstacles in front of them just so that they can experience everything.
Right. And we know that things are going to get bad for them. We know that there are challenges on the horizon, but you've also got that opportunity to give them some wins, and then to give them some losses. There's a book I remember as a child that was called "That's Good, That's Bad," and basically there's a child. He's sitting on a rock, and the tiger has come up. He says, "I'm going to eat you." He says, "That's fine. I'm too tired to run." And the tiger's like, "Well, that's no fun." He says, "Why are you so tired to run?" And so then he tells him the story of all the events that had happened, and everything that happens was either a good thing, I found a bunch of money. Oh, that's good. But then when I was on my way to spend it, then I got robbed. Oh, that's bad. But then I was able to meet somebody, and that's good, and just kind of take that all the way up until you hit that midpoint. That's another thing that I think really helps you get through the dreaded, I guess you call it the saggy middle, right? Where you don't quite know where you're going with the story.
It's just kind of that back and forth of victories and defeats.
Right.
Yeah.
It really helps.
So you explained that a little bit, but at the midpoint, you get a false victory, a false defeat. What happens from there?
So from there, the next probably, I'd say it's about a third of the story. No, not a third. What is it? A fifth?
Yeah,
where's my math? The next 17.5%. I don't know what that pictures into fractions. That's the bad guys close in. Okay, so we know that there is some conflict that's going to happen, and at the midpoint, that's when we switch from kind of being proactive or reactive and doing things to where the bad guys are coming in, or the problem is becoming more focused. Okay, and so you think about the your Star Wars analogy, and they have that false victory where they rescue the princess, but then they're now constantly being chased, and they're being chased within the Death Star. They're being chased once they get out of the Death Star. When they get to the moon of Yavin, now we've got the Death Star is coming around the planet, and it's going to get them. So the whole time, then the conflict is growing and growing at that point. And you get to a point at the 67.5%, right about I think that's the what is that? The 4/7, where you have kind of an all is lost moment, right? That it looks like things are going to not work out. There's going to be something has happened to where it doesn't look like they're going to succeed, and that leads into the Dark Knight. And this is where everything looks like there's no hope. The main characters have to kind of struggle with that whole this is where they kind of resolve that internal conflict, whatever it is that's keeping them from being the hero that they need to be within the story.
That's one of my favorite parts, because it's where the character has to face everything,
right,
and understand what's wrong.
And very often the main character is alone at this point. They've lost their friends, they've lost whatever it is that they've been working on, whatever they've been gathering, and the villain is going to win, or love is lost, and they aren't going to be able to they had this great relationship and they blew it, and now they're going to be alone for the rest of their life. They don't have their happily ever after, but they have that change. They have some internal change that lets them know that I can do this. And then that takes you to break into 3, which happens about the 75% point. So this is now where they say, I can do this. And there's a 5, I think of the correct term. It's a 5-point finale, basically what comes into. Gather the team, storm the castle, high tower surprise, dig down deep, and execute the new plan. So if we look at our Star Wars analogy, gather the team is where now we have the ships. We know what the plan is. We know how to defeat the Death Star. So everybody's going to storm the castle, and as they're going in the trenches, they're able to sneak past the defenses. So that's working out successfully for them. But then you have the high tower surprise. We'll have to destroy them ship to ship. And so now they're starting to lose again. Dig down deep, that's the use the Force, Luke, and the execute the new plan. Han Solo returns, saves the day, and you're able to go ahead and execute that new plan to succeed at the story. And then after that, execute the new plan, the very last thing is the final image. Okay, so that's where, in the Star Wars analogy, there's your final award ceremony.
Yeah.
And everything is good. You've got the happily ever after. Really just a wonderful, everything's tied up in a bow and everybody's happy.
Yeah. Love it. That's a great summary. So kind of pulling that all in together, if you were talking to what we call a pantser, somebody that doesn't plot, kind of writes by the seat of their pants, how would you what advice would you give them if they wanted to start using this process?
Well, I think one of the things that is really important to understand is that not everybody looks at things exactly the same way. And if somebody is a pantser, they feel very comfortable doing stories that way. They may be able to just use it as a troubleshooting point, right? They can go ahead and write the story just however is working for them, But if they get stuck, then you can come back to this as a tool. When I wrote my very first book, I didn't have any of the story structure down at all. I didn't know really anything about that. I just wrote. And I wrote, and I finished the novel, and I thought it was okay. I knew it had problems, but as I had other people read it, they says, this is pretty good. This has potential. The beginning's kind of long though. And I got that consistent feedback. I was introduced to a story structure. I can't remember exactly what it was. It was similar to the 7-point story structure though. And I went ahead and applied that then to my story. I said, okay, well, this should be happening at this point, and this should be happening at that point. What I found was I was pretty close in all of those. I actually hit all of the important points in writing the story, but I didn't hit the first, the break into 2. I didn't hit that until like 35%. And that was supposed to be at 25%. So it exactly matched up with what had everybody been telling me, that the beginning is too long. And that's because I'm not getting to that main point until, much later. So I was able to cut out a whole bunch of stuff from the beginning. But what I realized is that, we've all been listening to stories for our whole lives. We've been watching things on TV, watching movies, reading books. And so we have very much internalized this structure. And so I think it's possible to be a pantser and have that internalized to where you're able to hit those on your own without really laying it out in an outline form. But if you find that you're trying to pants and you don't know where you're going next, I think the first thing to do is take this structure or one of the other structures and lay it out against your story. See where you are, see if you're actually hitting points. If there's a point that you're completely missing, if there's a beat that you're not getting at all, that might be one of the reasons why you're struggling with that.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice.
That is really good advice.
Because I think, like you said, like we all do kind of internalize all the stories that we've consumed. So, but I think when we're looking at our own projects, sometimes we might not realize what's missing. So being able to lay it out against it is
it is hard
helpful.
because we're so very close to it. And when we're giving it to our friends to read, if it's somebody who is not well versed in story structure, but also enjoys reading, they might be able to give you some advice. The middle is kind of boring. What does that mean? Well, that means you're not hitting that progression towards the midpoint. Maybe you don't have enough tension. The bad guys aren't closing in fast enough or strong enough. And so you can recognize based on their feedback, then applying the story structure, the save the cat beat points, what exactly it is you need to do to fix a problem.
Yeah.
So that I think would probably be the best advice for somebody who feels like they're a pantser, but also feels like plotting has something to give them.
Awesome. Okay, so we just went over advice to pantsers, which I thought that was incredible advice, whether you're a pantser or a plotter. But I think we really only have 1 or 2 more questions for you. But what is the benefit of plotting for you? And because you said originally the first story you wrote, you didn't use a plot structure. So how has this changed your writing process?
Well, my first story, I did do an outline. I just didn't know what I was doing with that outline. So I didn't have the structure. There's nothing that scares me more than a blank page. If I'm looking at an empty document, my brain goes blank. I don't know what to do next. And so breaking it down into small little pieces is really helpful for me. And I can write a page. I can write 2 pages, but really even for a chapter, I try and have some sort of structure to my chapter to tell me what's going to be happening within the chapter. And so giving me that ability to pre-write, if you will, and lay the groundwork, lay out framework is very valuable for me. The other benefit that I get is, my schedule is not very conducive to writing. I don't have a lot of writing time. And so what little time I do have, I really need to make it count. And so having that laid out in a plot gives me a lot. I feel I have a lot more productivity in the time that I do have, because I know where I'm going and I know what I'm trying to say within that part of the story.
So, okay, full confession. I want to be a plotter so bad, but I've sort of been kind of a pantser. Organizing, I'm such an organized person, but for some reason sitting down and plotting is stressful for me, which is so annoying. So where do you start? If you're like, you have a story idea, because sometimes when I start, I just have to kind of get some stuff out there and get a feel for my characters. But how do you get started with plotting?
I think one of the best ways to do that is to start with a smaller idea. So what are the smaller structures? So for example, 3 acts. If you can say, this is what's going to happen in the first act, this is what's going to happen in the second act, this is the midpoint, this is the middle, and then this is what's going to happen in the third act. And I know what I want my story to start. I know where I want my story to end. That's a really good first step, and you can write that out, and then you can come to maybe one of the other more involved plotting structures. And I keep going back to the 7-point plot structure, because that one adds in a few extras, right? You've got the hook, you've got the first
the pinch
plot
points,
point,
I think.
you've got a plot point, a pinch point, the midpoint, a second pinch point, the last plot point, and then the climax. And so now you've gone, instead of 3 sections, now you have 7 different sections that you can look at. And then once you kind of got that in place, because the scene 1 is basically up until the first plot point, and scene 2 is between the 2 plot points, including the midpoint. And then scene 3 is that last little bit. So now you're just adding it a little bit more in the middle. Using the Save the Cat, you now have 15 different plot points, your different story beats. And again, they match up. You've still got the beginning, you've still got the first plot point, which is your break into 2. You've got a pinch point in the middle of the fun and games that you can work with. You've got, again, your midpoint. You've got that climax is broken down into 5 distinct points to try and work through. So once you have the really rough idea, then you can kind of get into finer and finer granularity. And I've actually worked with something called 40 cards, which is it's basically where you take the whole story and break it up into 40 different segments. And the first, I kind of follow the beats, but you've got 10 different cards worth of fun and games. You've got 5 different cards worth of debate. So you're able to take it and break it down into these smaller chunks that's just a little bit easier to work on. And that, for me, that's what makes it work the best, is start with the big picture and then just keep breaking it down into smaller and smaller chunks until, okay, now I have something small enough that I can actually write and just do this as my, sit down and type out the prose, as opposed to trying to figure out what's going to happen next, because I've already broken it down into those little bits.
That's awesome. And I'm sure it does save you a ton of time protects your writing time.
It protects that writing time. Well, and I can think about the plot points. I can think about all these different points while I'm doing other things. In fact, some of my most productive brainstorming time is when I'm doing my chores. If I'm doing the dishes, if I'm mowing the lawn, I'm doing something that requires me to be physically present and I can be mentally doing whatever I want, that I can do and come up with those. And then I quickly write them down in, 5 minutes after I've finished that task. And so then when I do get to my writing time, I've got this idea written down that I now know what I'm going to go ahead and work on. So.
Thank you, Don. That blew my mind. I'm definitely going to do that. I've struggled with that, and I never thought of kind of layering it like that before. So that's definitely what I'm going to be doing this week.
Good. No, it's definitely been it's the way I've settled into for writing. And the nice thing is that it works for both long and short fiction. So I've used it to write a short story of 15,000 words and, a novel of 70,000 words. Each of those little segments is just shorter in a short story, but it helps you can also say, okay, well, how long do I want this story to be? And okay, I just spent 20,000 words doing my opening image. That's probably too much, and so you need to kind of pare it back a little bit.
Yeah, it's good to have like the percentages too, along with those beats, right? It can kind of help you gauge that.
Yeah, it really is helpful.
Okay, well, before we close out, we typically like to have our guests leave a challenge for our listeners. So what challenge would you present to them concerning plotting, Save the Cat, or writing in general?
Okay. So I'm going to suggest you find Save the Cat, find out what the 15 different beats are, and then go find your favorite computer animated movie from your childhood. It could be DreamWorks, it could be Disney, it could be Pixar. But those movies, because they cost so much money to make, they are engineered down to the second. And you can take your these different beats and find and identify every single one of them. And like, if you want to find what the midpoint of the story is, you look and say, okay, where is the end of the movie, before the credits, subtract, from the beginning of the movie after the little introduction tells you don't copyright it, and then go to the middle and you will find it. It will be at exactly that point in the middle. And it's amazing to go back and kind of do this overlay on these stories that you're familiar with. If you're like most people, you've probably watched, we'll use Shrek for an example. How many times you watched Shrek?
I love Shrek.
Yeah, probably, 20, 30, 50,
Yeah,
120 times, right? And so you've got that very well internalized already. So to take that and then put those plot points on them, it becomes so much more clear. It's no longer just this abstract concept of what is the debate, what is the catalyst, what do I do in fun and games? You get to see what all the fun and games are that they've done and how that builds to the midpoint. So that's my challenge. Find the beats for Save the Cat, apply them to your favorite animated movie, and do it at least once, and you can probably do it to a half a dozen. The more you do it, the more it will help you to get a good concept of what these beats are and how to make them work in your own story.
Awesome. Thank you. I will definitely take you up on that challenge.
Great.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming on, Don. This has been really helpful, and well, for me, it's been insanely helpful. So we appreciate all your advice, and taking us through Save the Cat is always a treat because it helps a ton. So,
well, thank you very much for having me. This has been a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed meeting with you.
Thank you so much.
Because if you're drowning in words, so are we, and you might as well not do it alone.